G'day, we are in the brewery again today. Today we are brewing a Hef, or a wheat beer. A Hefeweizen, a wheat beer. I know I'll probably get stung by some people saying, oh, you didn't do this traditional, or you didn't do this traditional. It's not really about that today, even though it's going to be pretty close. A simple grain bill, there's not much use going into it too much. It's 50-50 I did. 50% wheat, 50% Pilsner malt. I ground the wheat separately because it was really tiny. I'll show you some pictures and do a talk over in a second. I'm going to do a step mash today. I wasn't going to because it's fine to do a single mash. I'm not doing a protein rest. It's more trouble than it's worth a lot of the time. But I am doing a step at 43 degrees. And that helps with the hydrolysis of ferulic acid. And it goes through a couple of steps, but it ends up helping the clove aroma you get in the beers, the phenolic aromas. So I'm going to try that. I really would like, it depends how things go, to do a bit of a decoction. Now I'm doing a double batch because this is where the difference comes into this recipe. It's more about the ferment than the recipe, this one. So I'm doing a double batch. For me, that's going to be a little bit hard out here to boil enough grain to do a true size decoction. If you haven't seen my decoction video, that's a great video, I think. You can go and see that one. I'll leave a link somewhere. But what I'm going to do is just pull out a few litres of malt. Once it's at its 43 degrees step, I'm just going to pull out a few kilo, boil it up for that 20-minute step, and then add it back in, and that'll help the rise as well, up to mash temps of 67 degrees Celsius. Then I'll just do a normal mash and then a mash out. Boiled, there'll only be, I was going to say single hop addition. I might add a little bit of a flavour hop at the end. I'll work that out in a minute with my IBUs, the bitterness. But other than that, yeah, this is about the ferment. Now, the way this come about was one of the Facebook groups, I think it was actually Home Brewing Australia, and they were talking about Hefeweizen, and Ben from Bridge Road had done a lot of study on it and was at some traditional breweries probably 10 years ago, I think he said 10 or 15 years ago, and he was trying to get some information out of the brewers, how they got those flavours into the beers. And one of the methods they did was they'd have a fermenting wort, and then 3 days into the ferment, they'd add about a third fresh wort, you know, non-fermenting, straight from the mashed boiled kettle, or cooled, and into that fermenter. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do and see if it makes a difference. So I'll have 2 full 6-gallon batches. So what I'm going to do is put one in one fermenter, ferment it for 3 days. I'm going to take a third of that out into another fermenter, and then top up the first fermenter with a fresh wort that I've had in the cube, you know, so I don't have to do 2 brew days. So so that's that fermenter, the first one. In the second fermenter, I'll have a third wort, which by day 3 should be full of yeast, and that'll be enough for a yeast starter for the second batch. So I'll put the other 2/3 of the wort from the cube, from the second cube, into that second fermenter, and I'll have 2 batches and 2 different methods, and we'll see what happens. You know, they might be exactly the same, they might not, but I thought it would make a good experiment and a good video. So without too much talking anymore, let's just do it. I'm not going to show too much of the mashing and everything. It's just 2 grains. As I said, it's 5 kilo of wheat, 5 kilo of Pilsner malt. I'm going to throw in a lot of rice hulls because I ground that wheat really fine to make sure I try and get some conversion out of it. But that's it. Let's go. Let's do it. I've got 42 litres of water in here. It's at 45 degrees. Hopefully by the time I put in the 10 kilo grain, it'll be down to about 43. And I'll leave it there for 20 minutes. But in the meantime, as I said, I'll take a decoction out and try and boil it up on my induction plate if it continues to work. Last time I went to use it, it didn't work, but I tested it this morning and it was working. So fingers crossed. All right, cheers. As I said before, it's a 50-50 grain bill, Pilsner malt and malted wheat. 5 kilos of each for my double batch. I always mill my wheat separately, so I don't have to mess around changing the settings on my bigger mill. So I use my Brewzilla on the wheat.
nice and fine. So just a simple Pilsner malt and some malted wheat. This happens to be Wyman. You can see it's much smaller. Not all of them, but a lot of them are a lot smaller than the grain, and that's why I mill them separately. But that's the crush of the wheat. I sort of pulverised it right up. I find when I don't, I'm often down a few points. So I start with about 42 litres of water at about 45-46 degrees. You want to be looking for about 43 to 45 degrees for this step, first step in the mash. And this is just to aid in the production of ferulic acid, which helps with the clove aroma and taste further down the track in the fermentation. Lots of wheat, so lots of rice hulls. I'm not sure how much I put in, but it was a few 100 grams all up, and I just sort of staggered it. I added some grain first, and then some wheat, and then some rice hulls. You could all mix it up beforehand, of course, but I've just found it easier to do it in parts. Bit of this, bit of that, and a lot of rice hulls. As you can see, it all mixed in pretty well. It's about 2 litres more than I'd normally use for 10 kilo of grain, but with all that wheat there, I thought I might have some flow issues, so a little bit of extra water might help with that, and it's not going to hurt anything else. So now I'm mashed in. I set my timer for 20 minutes, and I take some grain out for the decoction. Now you're mostly supposed to get grain, and so you usually use a sieve or something rather than a saucepan, but I was in a little bit of a hurry, so I wanted to try and have a bit more liquid in there, just a little bit more than usual, just to try and get it heated up quicker and maybe prevent a bit of scorching. I didn't bother measuring the amount. I just took what I thought was a manageable size. Now, if you don't want to do a decoction, don't do one. There's no need for it really. Not every recipe says you have to do one. I just wanted to do it on the day. And I like some of the qualities it usually adds to a beer. Just a little bit more complexity in that malt. I won't show the whole process. I've done a whole video on decoction. But for those that don't know, you just boil the malt. And I'm going to boil it for that 20 minutes that stand is at that I'm doing, that mash step. And you just got to keep stirring. If you stop stirring, it'll burn. I stopped for a second to take a few photos for Instagram and Facebook and for this section of the video. So I get my big ugly arm out of the way. And I got a little bit of scorching on the bottom. Not enough to ruin the batch, thankfully. But if I had left it any longer, it probably would have. You must keep stirring. And you'll smell the difference in the malt as you do it. It's like toasty smell. And at the end of the 20 minutes, I just add it back into the mash. That'll help it bring it up to the 67 degrees. And I'll make sure, of course, I turn up the Brewzilla to 67 as well. You can see there's a little bit of scorching on the bottom. I give it a good stir to get that hot grain mixed in well. I get the pump going, and it's just a normal mash from there on. I didn't really have any flow issues. It backed up a little bit through the process, but it was nothing to worry about at all, surprisingly. And I just left it for 45 minutes. After that, I step it up to 76 for mash out. It's usually about 20 minutes, half an hour. By the time it gets that whole grain bed up to your 76, heavy. And then you leave it there for 10 minutes. If you haven't got a good flow, it's okay to stir it during this time. Just get that flow going and that temperature happening. Turn on all the elements, or a couple of the bigger elements. Keep stirring so it doesn't overflow, but you get that temperature build up much quicker. It will clear up. Don't go scraping the bottom plate, but it will clear up again if you mess up. You can leave it for 10-15 minutes once you're at mash out temp, and turn the pump down a little bit, and it'll clear up again. And you can also use that method for the step between, the 43 degrees and the 67 degrees. Keep stirring so you can have the pump going full volume and the elements up high, and that way the step will happen much quicker. And I sparge with about 26 litres of water. You'll see at the end here my markings on my 35 litre Robo Brew, which I use as a HLT, my hot liquor ton. It only goes from 30 litres down to 10 litres, and I needed like 26 litres. So instead of sort of guessing, what I do is I use the pump to go from the 30 litres all the way down to the 10 litre mark, and then I use my 2 litre water jug for the last couple of litres, just so I know how much I'm sparging. But I just sparge right up to that fill mark. I actually go a little bit over that fill mark on my 65 litre. I go to the bottom of where gallons is written. And that's enough for me. I know if I boil that for around an hour, I'll get 2 cubes out of it, and I'm happy. You will see big chunks of proteins floating around, don't worry about it. I've seen a few questions in groups lately about it, but it's totally fine. I missed videoing the first edition of Tetning hops, that was 40 grams for the 60 minutes, and then I added another 30 grams for the last 10 minutes, just to freshen it up a bit. It's a bit controversial here. I did add a little bit of Werflock. After seeing all those proteins and that in the wort, I thought I might try and get rid of some of that, and we'll get our haziness still from the wheat and from the yeast. Fingers crossed. So 10 minutes after those last additions, I turn off the elements and I stick in the whirlpool arm. You probably don't really need to do this, but I thought I'd just put the whirlpool arm in, let it go for a couple of minutes, and that just centers the hop, you know, makes a trube cone. Especially with there's a lot of junk from the wheat and those proteins I talked about. So I let the whirlpool go for a couple of minutes, and then I take the whirlpool arm out and let it settle again for a couple of minutes before I put it in the cube. I fill up 2 cubes. Then after I fill up the 2 cubes, I had enough for a starter. So I grabbed my flask and I got just over a litre into the flask. That goes straight into the sink to cool down, to chill. Then I whack my yeast in. For this batch I used a WLP 300. I leave that overnight. The cubes cool overnight. And then the next day you can see my yeast starter was doing really well. I was feeling a little bit lazy today, so I used the siphon to put the cube into the fermenter. Add the yeast starter, and I'm setting it at 18 degrees. I'll leave a link down below if you want to check out these little refracts. They're good. They're quite expensive. There are better ones, there are cheaper ones. This is one of the cheaper ones, but still expensive. It's about 6 hours since I pitched the yeast, and I noticed that the tilt had dropped a point. I mean, that's a bit early. Maybe it's just the temperature change. I did pitch a little warm, but the fridge is bringing it down really fast. It's going pretty early, and I also noticed this, that it's actually bubbling. I don't know if you can see it, but see those bubbles are from the bubbling, so it is fermenting. This was taken just after midnight, and you can see it was well and truly on its way.
G'day again. Now I'll quickly explain what I'm doing. You can always Google these terms if you want to learn more. But the main reason for this video was the Krausening bit of the video. Now Krausening is where you have your fermenting wort. It's probably nearly done. It's on its way to be finished. But you add fresh wort to it, and that adds extra sugars. And then normally, or traditionally, you'd probably bottle there. And so what that does, you don't have to add sugar for carbonation in the bottle, and it also adds some of the freshness of the hops and things from that fresh wort you've added and traps it in the bottle. Mine, of course, is a little bit different. I'm not bottling and I'm not carbing in the keg. If I had space and time, I probably could try that, but I'm just going to wait till it's finished in the fermenter and then keg it. The other method is a kind of top cropping. Now top cropping is where you usually wait till your ferment's about halfway done. You take the foam off the top, the Krausen foam, and it's because that's usually grubby and got a bit of probably trube that's made it into the fermenter. And you get rid of that, and then you wait till the foam builds up again, and you take a nice fresh scrape of that foam, or a couple of spoonfuls, or however much you want to take, and you usually put that into a starter and get a starter going for your next batch of beer. Mine's a little bit different because I didn't use the foam, but because I've got the floating dip tube in the Brewzilla, I am taking the wort from the top of the wort, that third I took out from the top of the wort, which is nice fresh yeast, the really active stuff, and I'm putting that straight into the fermenter of unfermented wort. The reason they top crop is because the theory is all the dead yeast falls down to the bottom. Some of it will be getting stirred up still in the active yeast, but the freshest, most active yeast is at the top doing its work. And so it's chewing away at the sugars and bubbling out as Krausen, and that's where all the good, fresh, healthy yeast is.
So we'll have a look at how I did it. I just grabbed a cleaned, sanitised fermenter, of course. I got the second cube of wort that had been sitting there for 3 days, and I siphoned 2/3 of it into the fermenter. It was about 15 litres I put into the fermenter. After that, I simply moved it over next to my fermentation fridge. I hooked up a beer to beer line, and I used the pressure from my CO2 tank to push over 7 or 8 litres into this fermenter. That's my version of top cropping. So then I move on to the original fermenter. I simply open it up. I put the lid in some sanitizer for a second, and I pour in the rest of the cube, which again is around 7 or 8 litres. I just put the lid on, close everything up again. Neither of these are fermented under pressure. I didn't want to suppress any of the yeast flavours. So the spunding valve is there, but it's not being used, it's wound right open. If for some reason I want to close it at the end, I can. I just use a jar and a jug of sanitizer. 1, so I can see what's going on, and 2, as an airlock to stop bugs getting in. About 3 hours later, and although you can't really see much up there, it's fermenting.
Now hang on, I can hear people yelling at the screen. But what you're doing here isn't Krausening. It's not what you described at the start. It's not for carbonation and added at the end. Well, Ben never really got a clear answer, and he asked many questions. All we know is this method works. And we think the idea behind it is esters are created early in the ferment. So you create it early in the ferment, and then by adding fresh wort near the end, we're creating more. But that's the thing about brewing. Names, terms, they change. Their meanings change. Whirlpool used to be just for a whirlpool to centrifuge trube cone. Now, as soon as you mention it, people say you have to be under 80 degrees. Tell you what, 10 years ago, no one ever thought that. So things change. You tell me what it is, because apparently this works. So right now I've got a fermenter in this fridge here. That's the Krausening method, and a fermenter of this exactly the same wort in the fridge over there with it using the top cropping method. So it'll be interesting to see the difference. I was going to push other differences in the second fermenter. I was going to push the temperature up because you get more clove with this yeast if you ferment it hotter, and more banana if you ferment it cooler. But I wanted to keep, if you make too many differences in an experiment, you don't know which one made the difference. I don't know if the top cropping one will be better or the Krausening one will be better. It might just be that I change the temperature. So I'm doing it at both the same temperatures, 18 degrees. I chose 18 degrees because I had one mate, really good mate, saying 17 is his favourite temperature, and another good mate saying 19 was his favourite temperature. So I just chose the one in the middle for this yeast. But that's about it. I'll leave the tasting for another video. That'll probably be in 2 or 3 weeks. These will probably take another week to finish, or maybe a little bit less. By the time I keg them and they carb up, it'll be 2 or 3 weeks in the new year. See you in the new year. All right, thanks for watching. I hope this will be interesting. I think it will be. Be good to see if I can tell the difference between the two. Anyway, thank you. Like, subscribe, share. Thank you to my patrons. And if I don't see you beforehand, have a good Christmas. Cheers. I'll just run through the time frame. This was brewed on a Friday, chilled overnight, and I pitched the yeast starter on the Saturday. On the Monday, I did the Krausening. I took 1/3 of it out, added 1/3 of fresh wort. We are now on the Wednesday morning, You can see it's still fairly active. It did calm down, but after I added the fresh wort, of course, it took off again. We have had a little bit of blowout, which is one of the reasons why I didn't want the gauge on there, just in case it got filled with fermenting wort, of course. But what I'm going to do, I've just raised the temperature a bit. It shouldn't have many days to go. We're down under 1.020 at the moment. But before it gets to the end, I am going to put pressure on it. So I'll take this off, I'll put a fresh bit of line on and the pressure gauge, and I'll just get the last, I don't know, 5 points or something under pressure, just to trap in some of those flavours and aromas, just like you would if you were going to put it in a bottle when you krausened. How many points out is a bit of a question mark unless you've done a forced ferment or you're very accurate with your brewing and your final gravities. I'd suggest a forced ferment, which is take something like a starter or pour some off and be very, very nice to it. Add extra air, shake it up, put it somewhere warm and see what it ferments out to. And then you'd stop maybe 3 points before the end and you could try bottling it. You'd have to use strong bottles because you don't want it to blow. That's why some of these beers are done in stronger bottles. And you might be able to get up to your carbonation level without adding, you know, any external CO2. Otherwise, yeah, I'm just going to close it off. I will have to put the gauge on and set it to a pressure so we don't have any chance of popping something. And then once it's finished, I'll put it in the keg. Now here we are on the same Wednesday. Keep in mind this one is 3 days behind. So it was 2/3 fresh wort and then 1/3 of fermenting wort put on top. The ferment looks very different. By this stage in the other one, it was way more krausen and it looked a bit dirtier and foamier. This has got quite, besides on the edges, it's got quite a clean looking krausen. Very white. Doesn't look like it's fermenting much faster or very fast, but down the bottom you can see we're quite active. Now, I haven't got the same aroma in this fridge. It's nowhere near as banana-y. Like as soon as I open that other fridge, all I smell is big banana. Here I'm not really getting much aroma at all of any sort. I haven't stuck my nose down near the jar, but too far down for me. But we'll see how it goes anyway. I think that'll do, and we'll see you at the tasting.